The town of Braydon, Pennsylvania, once a proud, bustling community, had become something unrecognizable. Storefronts that once displayed handmade goods and local crafts were now boarded up, their closed for business signs faded and curling at the edges. The streets, once filled with laughter and the chatter of neighbors, now carried an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional sound of a shattered bottle or the distant echo of gunfire. Gangs had carved out sections of the town as their own, marking territory with graffiti and making it clear who was in charge. Drug deals happened in plain sight, their transactions quicker than the flick of a wrist. Residents who could afford to leave had packed up and never looked back, while those who remained lived in quiet fear, avoiding eye contact with the figures that lurked in the shadows. At the heart of it all stood the police station, a crumbling relic of what it once was. The paint peeled in long, jagged strips, revealing years of neglect beneath. Inside, rows of desks sat abandoned, covered in dust, the air stale with the scent of old coffee and paperwork left untouched for months. Phones rang occasionally, but there was no one left to answer. The police force had dwindled down to a single man. Sheriff Jack Reynolds sat at his desk, running a tired hand over his stubbled jaw as he skimmed through another case file that would likely never be closed. He had stopped counting the hours he worked. Days blurred together, and nights were spent in his office chair, dozing off to the rhythmic hum of the police scanner. He refused to go home. If he did, who would answer the next distress call? His uniform, once crisp, was now permanently wrinkled from long shifts, with no relief. His gun belt sat heavier on his hips these days, not from the weight of the weapon, but from the burden of responsibility he carried alone. Once he had a team, 20 officers. Now just one, himself. The others had walked away not because they didn't care, but because they had no choice. The town's funding had been slashed years ago, swallowed up by greedy politicians who had lined their own pockets and left law enforcement to rot. Payroll delays stretched from weeks to months until finally, the paychecks just stopped coming. The younger officers left first, unable to afford working for free. The veterans followed soon after, some taking security jobs elsewhere, others leaving law enforcement altogether. But Jack had stayed. They had called him a fool, told him he was wasting his time fighting a losing battle. The criminals certainly thought so. They watched him from the alleyways and street corners, their grins wide and full of mockery. He had arrested some of them before, but without prosecutors willing to take the cases or jail cells to hold them, they walked free every time. Some even made a game out of it, getting arrested just to see how long it would take to be released. Still, Jack refused to give up. This was his town. He had grown up here, fallen in love here, built his life here. He wouldn't let it rot just because everyone else had turned their backs on it. But he wasn't blind to reality. The cartel was coming. The whispers had started months ago, first as rumors, then as cold, hard facts. Miguel Cortez, a name that made even the most hardened criminals wary, had set his sights on Braydon. The town was vulnerable, unprotected, ripe for the taking. Drugs would flow through its veins like lifeblood. Corruption would seep into every crack of its foundation. And once the cartel was in, they would never leave. Jack knew they were watching him. He had seen the unfamiliar cars parked just out of sight, seen the same faces lingering too long outside the station, scanning his every move. They were waiting, biding their time, and when the moment was right, they would strike. The weight of it all pressed down on him as he reached for his coffee, now cold. He took a sip anyway. It was bitter, but it kept him awake. A gust of wind rattled the station windows, and Jack barely glanced up. Probably just the storm rolling in. He turned his attention back to the files on his desk. Another missing teenager. Then he heard it. The sound of tires crunching against gravel. Slow, deliberate. His pulse quickened. No one came to the station at this hour. Not unless there was trouble. Jack reached for his gun, his instincts kicking in as he peered through the blinds. A black SUV sat parked outside, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. Not local. Not a gang vehicle either. The engine shut off. The doors remained closed. Jack's grip on his pistol tightened. Something was coming. The tires stopped crunching. The engine cut off, leaving behind an eerie silence. Jack's grip on his gun tightened as he watched the doors remain closed, the vehicle motionless as if waiting for him to make the first move. Then, without warning, the driver's door opened. A man in a sharp black suit stepped out first, scanning the surroundings with trained efficiency. His posture, the way his gaze flicked across the street before settling on the station, told Jack everything he needed to know. Secret Service. His chest tightened. What the hell was going on? Before he could process it, the passenger door swung open. The man who stepped out was instantly recognizable, his golden hair almost gleaming under the flickering street lamp. A navy suit, a purposeful stride, a presence that filled the entire lot the moment he moved. Jack's fingers slipped from his coffee cup. The ceramic hit the desk with a dull clatter. Donald J. Trump. Jack's brain struggled to catch up with reality. He had spent years watching politicians make empty promises, their faces appearing on news segments while his town crumbled. Now one of those faces was standing right outside his station. In Braydon. In the middle of the night. The station door creaked open as Trump stepped inside. The room, dimly lit and cluttered with neglected paperwork, suddenly felt suffocatingly small. His presence was impossible to ignore. He wasn't flanked by reporters, wasn't surrounded by a camera crew. Just him, his sharp gaze sweeping across the sorry state of what was once a police department. Jack's throat was dry. He forced himself to stand, pushing aside the mess on his desk. Mr. President? The words came out rough, uncertain. He still wasn't sure this wasn't a hallucination. What are you doing here? Trump adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes flicking to the nearly abandoned station, the flickering lights, the empty desks that once belonged to officers who had given up. I heard there was still one man left fighting for this town. His voice was steady, low, carrying a weight that sent a chill through Jack's spine. I wanted to see him myself. Jack opened his mouth, but no words came. The absurdity of the moment crashed over him. He had been abandoned by his own government for years, left to scrape by, to patrol a town with no backup, to answer calls no one else was coming for. And yet, standing in front of him was the most powerful man in the country. Before he could gather his thoughts, the police radio crackled to life. All units, possible armed robbery, Sinclair's gas station, suspects on site, requesting immediate assistance. Jack already knew there were no other units. His jaw clenched as he reached for his gun belt. The town didn't wait for anyone. He needed to move. Then, Trump nodded toward the radio. Take me with you? Jack's head snapped up. Sir? Trump's expression was unreadable. Let's go. Jack hesitated, then grabbed his keys. This was going to be a long night. The cruiser's engine grumbled as it rolled through Braydon's empty streets, its headlights cutting through the fog that clung to the pavement. Inside, Jack gripped the wheel with practiced ease, his eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. Trump sat in the passenger seat, silent, his gaze locked on the scene unfolding outside. They passed rows of abandoned storefronts, their windows shattered, neon signs flickering weakly before giving out entirely. Shadows moved in the alleys. Figures huddled near doorways, exchanging cash and small plastic bags with quick practice motions. A young mother gripped her child's wrist and hurried across the sidewalk, her eyes darting toward the car as if hoping, just for a second, that it might stop and offer help. But she knew better. No one came to save Braydon anymore. Trump exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening against his knee. The streets of America weren't supposed to look like this. Not here. Not in a town that once thrived. The deeper they drove, the worse it got. A liquor store with its steel gate half open. A man slumped against the entrance, unconscious or worse. A gas station where teenagers leaned against the pumps, smoking, their faces hollow. A gang insignia spray-painted across a courthouse door. How did it get this bad? Trump's voice was low, rough. Jack didn't take his eyes off the road. Local politicians cut a deal. Promised investment in exchange for tax breaks. The money never came, but the criminals did. Cops tried to fight back, but without funding, without resources, his grip on the wheel tightened. They walked. Had to. You can't feed your family on a paycheck that never arrives. Trump was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of it. The headlights passed over a burned-out police precinct, its sign barely hanging from rusted chains. The building looked like a corpse. Federal funding? Trump finally asked. Jack let out a dry, humorless laugh. Supposed to have it. Disappeared before it ever reached us. Someone lined their pockets, and no one ever followed up. Trump's jaw clenched. He had seen mismanagement before, corruption, incompetence. But this wasn't just a town in decline. This was a town abandoned. Then, the radio crackled. All units, armed robbery in progress. Sinclair's gas station. Suspects still on site. Immediate assistance requested. Jack reached for the gear shift, accelerating hard. He didn't need the call to tell him he was the only one responding. He always was. Trump glanced at him. Let's end this. The gas station came into view fast. A single overhead light flickered above the storefront, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. The parking lot was empty except for a single sedan, engine running. Inside, through the grimy glass, Jack could see two masked figures. One of them was waving a handgun. The other was shoving what looked like a terrified elderly cashier toward the register. Jack pulled up hard, killing the engine. His heartbeat slowed, steadying. He reached for his weapon, pushing the door open. Trump stepped out with him. Jack turned, eyes sharp. Sir, stay in the car. Trump didn't acknowledge it. He was already walking forward. Inside, one of the masked men spotted them and laughed. You gotta be kidding me. One cop. He gestured at Trump with the barrel of his gun. What's this guy, your lawyer? Trump stopped just short of the door. His voice was calm, cold. You have 3 seconds to walk out, or your next home is a federal prison. The two men hesitated, their postures shifting. Something about him, the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, made them rethink. But not enough. The one closest to the counter swung his gun toward them. He never got the chance to pull the trigger. Jack moved first, stepping forward and knocking the weapon aside with a single fluid motion. Before the robber could react, Jack grabbed his wrist and twisted. The gun dropped to the floor. The second man lunged, but Trump was already on him. He caught the attacker's arm mid-swing, gripping hard. There was a crack of knuckles, a sharp yelp. Trump twisted, sending the man's gun clattering to the tile. With a shove, he sent the would-be criminal stumbling backward into a shelf of snack cakes. The first man tried to run. Jack caught him by the collar, slamming him against the counter. Stay down. For a long moment, the only sound in the store was the sharp, panicked breathing of the cashier. Then, from a distance, sirens. Jack exhaled, stepping back. The men were down. Trump straightened his tie, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. The cashier, still shaking, looked between them. Thank you. Jack nodded once, hauling one of the robbers onto his feet. Trump met Jack's gaze. The work wasn't done yet. Jack shoved the last suspect into the back seat of his cruiser, slamming the door shut just as the distant wail of sirens grew louder. For once, they weren't coming too late. The neighboring county's deputies finally arrived, their cruisers skidding to a stop in the gas station lot. But the fight was already over. The cashier sat trembling behind the counter, the suspect subdued, the scene under control. Jack let out a slow breath, glancing at Trump, who was adjusting his cuffs as if this had been nothing more than a routine stop. Neither man spoke as Jack climbed into the driver's seat, the cruiser pulling out and heading back toward the station. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the dull ache of exhaustion, but Jack knew there was no time for rest. Braydon would keep spinning, and tomorrow he'd be answering another call, handling another crisis, still alone. That reality sat heavy on his shoulders as he drove through the same broken streets, past the same boarded-up shops, past the people who had stopped hoping things would ever change. The station was silent when they arrived, the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows over the empty desks. The place felt colder than before, smaller, like the walls were closing in. Jack walked to his office, rubbing the back of his neck, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He hadn't expected the president to follow, but when he turned, Trump was there, stepping inside as if he belonged. For the first time, Trump sat. The chair creaked under his weight, but he didn't lean back, didn't relax. His hands folded together on the desk, his eyes fixed on Jack. The air in the room shifted, something unspoken stretching between them. "You shouldn't be fighting this battle alone," Trump said, his voice quieter than before but firm. Jack exhaled, sinking into the chair across from him. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "I don't do this for recognition," he muttered. "I do it because it's the right thing." Trump studied him for a long moment, then nodded. There was no argument, no speech about duty or sacrifice. Just understanding. Then, without a word, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folder. He set it on the desk between them, the thick pages shifting slightly as they settled. Jack frowned, his calloused fingers reaching for it. When he opened it, his breath stalled. A signed executive order. He skimmed the first page, his tired eyes scanning the words, his heart hammering in his chest. Federal emergency funds for Braydon's law enforcement. Immediate recruitment of officers. Brand new equipment, training, and protection. Everything he had begged for, fought for, had been denied time and time again. It was all there. Jack's hands gripped the edges of the folder, as if afraid it might disappear. He looked up, his voice low, almost disbelieving. "This is real?" Trump didn't blink. "It's real?" Jack swallowed hard. He had spent years fighting a losing war, standing against an enemy that outnumbered him, outgunned him, and yet he had never stopped. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, something shifted inside him. Trump leaned forward, his voice steady. "I'm going to fix this town, Sheriff. And I'm starting with you." The words settled between them, heavier than any promise Jack had ever heard. He looked down at the documents again, at the signature scrawled across the bottom, proof that this wasn't just talk. This wasn't a headline, a campaign speech, a meaningless gesture. This was action. Jack closed the folder slowly, his fingers pressing against the cover. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe. Help was coming. Braydon was no longer a town drowning in despair. The streets that once belonged to criminals now belonged to the people again. Patrol cars cruised steadily through the neighborhoods, their presence no longer a rarity, but a reassurance. The once empty police station now hummed with life. Officers filled the desks, radios crackled with activity, and order had been restored. Storefronts that had been boarded up were open again, their neon signs glowing against the night. Families walked the sidewalks without fear. Children played in yards that had once been abandoned. Crime hadn't disappeared, but it had fallen, sharply, significantly. The gangs that once laughed at the law had either been locked up or run out. The town had changed. Jack Reynolds stood at the front of the station, arms crossed as he watched his officers move with purpose, a force that finally had the numbers, the tools, and the backing to do what needed to be done. He had fought for this for years, and now, for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. Then he heard it, the deep, familiar hum of an approaching SUV. The black vehicle rolled up smoothly, stopping just in front of the station. Jack didn't have to see who was inside to know. The door swung open, and Trump stepped out. He took a slow look around, taking in the town that had once been on the brink of ruin. The corners of his mouth lifted into a smirk. "Told you I'd fix it." Jack's chest swelled as he straightened, then raised his hand in a sharp salute. Behind him, The American flag rippled high above the station, a symbol of what had been rebuilt. Trump returned his gaze, then stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough for Jack to hear. "The fight isn't over. You in?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Always?" Please click on one of the videos on your screen to watch another story celebrating the human spirit. If you enjoy meaningful stories, please subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on our latest uploads. Thanks for being a part of Unbroken Stories.